It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Hand over the digital keys, Dr. Alastair Vance demanded, his voice echoing through the glass-walled boardroom. You don't deserve to be listed as a lead on a project of this magnitude. Eleanor Nora Vance stood at the end of the long mahogany table, her hands tucked into the pockets of her $40 off-the-rack blazer. The cheap polyester felt scratchy against her skin, a sharp contrast to the Italian silk draped over her father's shoulders. Around them, the board members of Vance Biotech sat in judgmental silence, their eyes darting between the legendary surgeon and his quiet, unassuming daughter. Victoria Vance leaned back in her leather chair, her designer heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She adjusted her pearls, the scent of expensive, cloying lilies clinging to her like a second skin. Be reasonable, Nora, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. Your father has a reputation to uphold. A mere researcher shouldn't be the face of the Vance legacy's greatest breakthrough. It's unseemly. I spent 6 years on this sequence, Mother, Nora said. Her voice was a low, steady vibration, betraying none of the cold fury rising in her chest. It's not just a breakthrough. It's my life's work. Alastair let out a sharp, barking laugh. He tapped his heavy gold signet ring against the table, a rhythmic, mocking sound that set Nora's teeth on edge. Your life's work. You were cleaning beakers and running basic simulations. I provided the lab, the funding, and the name. You were essentially doing janitorial work with a microscope. Now, sign the transfer documents. In the corner, Sienna Vance held her smartphone aloft, her ring light reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't looking at the tension in the room. She was checking her angles for a live stream. Just do it, Nora, she muttered, her thumb hovering over the screen. The followers are already asking why the smart sister is being so difficult. You're ruining the aesthetic of the family announcement. Nora looked at her sister, then back at the man who shared her DNA but none of her heart. The injustice of it burned. They didn't just want the credit. They wanted to erase her existence from the scientific community entirely. They wanted her to be a ghost in her own success. The bill for your upbringing isn't cheap, Nora, Victoria added, leaning forward until the light caught the sharp edges of her diamonds. The private schools, the tutors, the roof over your head for 26 years. You owe us this. Consider it a final payment for the Vance name. Nora felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket. It was small, cold, and held the true encryption key. The one piece of the puzzle her father didn't realize was missing from the server. He thought he had everything. He thought his arrogance was a substitute for understanding the code she had written in the middle of the night while he was at gala dinners. At the back of the room, Marcus Thorne caught her eye. Her lab partner's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his clipboard. He was the only one who knew the truth, the only witness to the thousands of hours she'd poured into the project. He looked like he wanted to scream, but Nora gave him a microscopic shake of her head. Not yet. She walked forward, the squeak of her budget shoes loud in the oppressive silence. She picked up the fountain pen sitting on the mahogany. It was heavy, gold-plated, and felt like a weapon. Fine, she whispered. She signed the document with a sharp, jagged flourish. Alastair snatched the paper away before the ink was even dry, his eyes gleaming with a predatory triumph. He didn't even look at her as he handed it to the legal counsel. Good, Alastair said, already turning his back to her to address the board. Now that the help has been handled, let's discuss the IPO. We're looking at a $300 million opening on Friday. Nora didn't wait for a goodbye. She didn't expect one. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her head held high even as her heart hammered against her ribs. As the heavy oak doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of her father's self-congratulatory toast, she pulled her phone from her pocket. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through her contacts, finding a name that didn't belong in the Vance world, Julian Sterling. She hit dial. It picked up on the first ring. Is it done? The deep, authoritative voice asked. They took the bait, Nora said, stepping into the elevator. She watched her reflection in the polished chrome, a woman they thought they had broken. They think they own the cure. They don't realize they just bought a hollow shell. The sequence will fail the moment they try to move it to the production servers. And the real data? Julian asked. Safe, along with the recordings of the last 20 minutes. Nora watched the floor numbers descending, leaving the penthouse suite behind. They wanted to talk about the bill for my life. I think it's time I sent them one of my own. I'll have the car waiting at the side entrance, Nora. Your new lab is ready, and the lawyers are already drafting the injunction. The elevator chimed as it reached the lobby. Nora stepped out, passing the giant portrait of her father that dominated the foyer. She didn't look back. The countdown had begun. In 48 hours, the Vance Biotech IPO would launch, and in 49 hours, she would pull the rug out from under their billion-dollar feet. She stepped out into the rain, the cold air hitting her face like a promise. She wasn't just leaving a building, she was leaving a cage. And when she returned, she wouldn't be the janitorial help. She would be the owner. The next morning, the humid air of the city felt like a wet wool blanket against Nora's skin. She stood in the dim, narrow hallway of her apartment building near the university, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee clinging to the peeling wallpaper. Her hand trembled slightly as she slid her key into the lock of 4B, but the metal teeth refused to bite. The cylinder was cold, stubborn, and completely immobile. A heavy, metallic thud echoed behind her. She turned to see the building's superintendent, a man who had spent 3 years ignoring her maintenance requests, now standing tall with a clipboard and an air of borrowed authority. "Locks were changed at dawn, Miss Vance," he said, his eyes fixed on a smudge on the wall just above her head. "Orders from the primary leaseholder. Your things are already being processed for disposal." Nora felt a sharp prick of heat behind her eyes, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. This was Victoria Vance's signature move, surgical, cold, and designed to leave the victim with nothing but the clothes on their back. Her mother didn't just burn bridges. She salted the earth to ensure nothing ever grew there again. "Processing for disposal." Nora's voice was a whisper, but it didn't shake. "There are 5 years of research notes in there. My laptop. My father's old journals from before he started the foundation. Dr. Alastair Vance was very specific," the man muttered, finally looking at her with a flicker of pity that felt more insulting than a slap. "He said anything of value belongs to the Vance Foundation. The rest is trash." The elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open with a cheerful digital chime. Sienna Vance stepped out, her smartphone already held aloft like a weapon. She was draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than Nora's annual tuition, her face perfectly contoured for the ring light she carried in her left hand. "Oh, look, guys," Sienna said, her voice pitched for the benefit of her 3 million followers. "The prodigal sister is finally home. Too bad she forgot her key." And her dignity. Sienna circled her, the lens of the camera lingering on Nora's scuffed shoes and the $40 off-the-rack blazer she'd slept in. The cloying, expensive scent of Sienna's lily perfume filled the narrow space, a smell that had always signaled a coming storm in the Vance household. "Victoria said you'd be here," Sienna smirked, lowering the phone for a second to reveal the predatory gleam in her eyes. "She wanted me to make sure you understood the new reality. You're officially a non-person, Nora. No name, no credit cards, no roof. Dad even had the university revoke your lab access this morning. He said he doesn't want janitorial staff polluting the Vance biotech legacy." Nora watched her sister, a strange, icy calmness settling over her. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the sleek surface of the encrypted drive Julian Sterling had given her the night before. Inside that small piece of plastic was the heartbeat of the upcoming IPO, the actual chemical formulas that Alastair thought were safely tucked away in the apartment's server. "Is that all, Sienna?" Nora asked, her voice as level as a horizon line. Sienna's smirk faltered. She had expected tears, a frantic plea, or at least a scene she could edit into a viral fall of the disowned montage. "Is that all? You're homeless, Eleanor Nora Vance. You're a nobody. By tomorrow, when the IPO goes live, we'll be worth billions and you'll be sleeping in a shelter." "The IPO," Nora repeated softly. She looked past her sister at the door to 4B. They thought they had locked her out of her life. They didn't realize she'd already moved the house. "You're right." Tomorrow changes everything. She turned and walked toward the stairs, ignoring the elevator. "Where are you going?" Sienna shouted after her, her voice shrill with the frustration of a failed performance. "You have nothing, you're nothing." Nora didn't look back. Once she reached the street, she pulled out her phone and tapped a single name, Marcus Thorne. "Marcus," she said as she hit the sidewalk, the cold morning wind finally feeling like a promise instead of a threat. "Tell Julian the bait is taken. They think they've cleared the board." "And the data?" Marcus asked, his voice steady through the speaker. Nora glanced back at the towering glass spire of the Vance biotech headquarters visible in the distance. "They have the hardware. I have the soul. Tell the lawyers to prepare the injunction for the opening bell." "I want to see Alistair's face when he tries to run the IPO simulation with an empty database." She stepped into a waiting black sedan, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that drowned out the city's noise. The countdown wasn't just for the IPO anymore. It was for the moment the Vances realized they hadn't just changed the locks, they'd locked themselves in a room with a ticking clock. 2 days later, the morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian Sterling's private sanctuary, casting long, sharp shadows across the obsidian desk. Eleanor Nora Vance stood by the glass, looking down at the city that felt smaller than it had 48 hours ago. The transition from the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of her family's empire to this 80-story fortress had been seamless, but the weight in her chest remained. She turned as the heavy oak door clicked shut. Marcus Thorne entered, his usual lab coat replaced by a crisp charcoal suit that looked uncomfortable on his frame. He held a tablet like a holy relic. "The Vances just went live with the pre-IPO press conference," he said, his voice tight. "Alistair is currently telling the world that Vance Biotech has achieved a singular breakthrough in synthetic protein folding. He's calling it the crown jewel of the family legacy." Nora felt a cold ripple of amusement. She walked to the desk where a single glass of water sat, its surface beaded with icy condensation. She touched the glass, the chill grounding her. "The crown jewel is a hollow shell, Marcus. He's selling them a beautiful car with no engine." "They don't know that yet," Marcus countered, tapping the screen. "Look at this." He slid the tablet across the polished surface. A video was trending, posted only 10 minutes prior by Sienna Vance. In the footage, the influencer was laughing, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor of Nora's old laboratory. She was filming a workspace refresh, which mostly involved 2 burly movers tossing Nora's specialized equipment into industrial bins. "Out with the old, in with the gold," Sienna chirped into the camera, tossing a handful of Nora's handwritten research notes into a shredder. "Sometimes you have to trim the dead weight to let the family tree really bloom. Sorry, sis. Some of us are born for the spotlight and some of us are just background noise." The rage was a familiar, hot spark in Nora's gut. She watched her sister's curated smile, the way she mocked the years of labor Nora had poured into those pages. It was a public execution of her career, broadcast to 3 million followers. "She thinks she's deleting me," Nora whispered, her eyes tracking the shredder's blades. "She's deleting their only chance at survival," a new voice interrupted. Julian Sterling stepped into the light, the smell of expensive sandalwood and old paper trailing him. He didn't look like a man about to gamble $12 million. He looked like a man who had already won. He placed a heavy, cream-colored folder on the desk. "The injunction is drafted," Julian said, his gaze meeting Nora's. "But more importantly, the partnership agreement is ready. This isn't just a paycheck, Nora. This is the foundation of Sterling Vance research. You provide the soul, the actual data, and I provide the shield. 12 million for the initial seed, 51% ownership to you." Nora looked at the document. It was the weapon she had been forging in the dark for years. But before she could reach for the pen, the phone on the desk buzzed. The caller ID displayed a name that made Marcus stiffen, Dr. Alistair Vance. Nora hit the speakerphone. "I hope you're watching the news, Eleanor," her father's voice boomed, dripping with a condescending triumph that made the air in the room feel thin. "The ticker is already being reserved. The board has approved the final simulation. We've moved the IPO up to Friday." That seems rushed, Alistair, Nora said, her voice a flat, calm line. Are you sure the system is stable? Alistair laughed, a dry, grating sound. The system is fine. We've bypassed your little security locks. It turns out your brilliant mind wasn't quite as impenetrable as you thought. We found the back doors. We don't need you, Nora. We never did. You were a fluke, a janitor who learned a few big words. I'm calling to tell you that the locks on your apartment have been changed. The lease was under the company name. Consider it a final lesson in business. I see, she replied, her fingers grazing the edge of Julian's contract. You're really going through with the simulation on the live floor. In front of the world, Alistair sneered. Victoria has already invited the governor. By Friday, the Vance name will be synonymous with the future of medicine, and you will be a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. Don't bother calling again. We've scrubbed you from the servers. The line went dead. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus looked like he wanted to punch the wall, but Nora simply picked up the fountain pen. The weight of it felt perfect. He thinks he found the back doors, Marcus whispered. He doesn't realize those weren't back doors. They were traps. He sees what he wants to see, Nora said. She signed her name at the bottom of Julian's contract with a steady, fluid motion. The ink was dark and permanent. He sees a daughter he can bully. He doesn't see the woman who wrote the code he's about to bet his entire life on. She handed the folder back to Julian. He offered his hand, and as they shook, the power in the room shifted. It was no longer about a family dispute. It was a corporate war. 2 days, Nora said, her eyes turning toward the digital clock on the wall, the red numbers ticking down with cold precision. The simulation runs at 10 a.m. Friday. Marcus, call the lawyers. I want the injunction served the moment the first line of code hits the public server. She looked back at the tablet, where Sienna was still laughing in the ruins of her old life. Nora didn't feel the sting anymore. She felt the calm of a predator watching its prey walk into a cage. They think they've cleared the board, Nora whispered, the wait for it moment hanging in the air like a bared blade. But they've forgotten one thing. I didn't just build the engine. I built the self-destruct. The countdown to the $12 million handshake had ended. The countdown to the Vance collapse had just begun. The day before the Vance Medical Foundation gala, the clinical silence of the surgical wing was broken only by the expensive hiss of a high-end espresso machine. Dr. Alistair Vance stood behind his mahogany desk, the sunlight catching the gold leaf on his Surgeon of the Year trophy. He didn't look up when the door opened. He didn't have to. He knew the gait of his eldest daughter, a sound he had associated with disappointment for over 2 decades. Nora stepped into the office, the soles of her sensible shoes silent on the polished white marble. The air here smelled of antiseptic and ego, a combination that usually made her throat tighten. Today, she felt only a strange, vibrating calm. She adjusted the lapel of her off-the-rack blazer, her fingers brushing the small, encrypted flash drive hidden in her pocket. The board just approved the final press release, Alistair said, his voice a smooth baritone designed to soothe wealthy patients and intimidate subordinates. He finally looked up, his eyes scanning her with the same detached precision he used on a malignant tumor. The Vance Vitality Engine is being hailed as the greatest leap in diagnostic AI. My name will be on every medical journal from London to Tokyo by Monday. It's a complex system, Father, Nora said, her voice steady. She walked toward the desk, placing a thick, leather-bound manual on the surface. I've compiled the final synchronization protocols. There's a section on page 42 regarding the server stress test. You should read it before the live demonstration tomorrow night. Alistair let out a short, bark-like laugh, the sound echoing off the glass-fronted cabinets filled with vintage surgical tools. He didn't even touch the manual. Instead, he leaned back in his Italian leather chair, the material creaking under his weight. Nora, you've always had a talent for the minutiae. The janitorial work of data, as I call it. But don't mistake your ability to organize my thoughts for actual vision. I am the architect of this legacy. You are simply the one who polished the stones. The office door swung open again, and Sienna Vance drifted in, her phone held aloft at a perfect 45-degree angle. She was draped in silk that cost more than Nora's annual research grant, her face a mask of sculpted perfection. Nora, move to the left, Sienna snapped, not looking away from her screen. You're casting a shadow on the legacy plaque. I'm doing a behind-the-genius reel for the followers, and the lighting in here is already moody enough without your gloomy energy. Nora stepped back, watching as Sienna leaned over their father's shoulder, the two of them framing a shot of familial excellence. Alistair smiled for the camera, the practiced, benevolent grin of a man who believed he was untouchable. I'm serious about the server load, Nora said, her voice cutting through Sienna's chatter about engagement metrics. The architecture is designed for precision, not performance theater. If you push the diagnostic speed past 80% during the gala without the secondary bypass I've detailed, the system will trigger a security reset. It's a safety feature. Alistair's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. He reached out and slid the manual toward the edge of the desk, nearly knocking it into the wastebasket. Safety features are for people who don't know how to drive the machine, Eleanor. I built this foundation on taking risks you couldn't possibly understand. Tomorrow night isn't about safety. It's about dominance. Now, if you're finished with your little warnings, Marcus Thorne is waiting for you in the lobby. Apparently, you have packing to do. I do, Nora agreed softly. She looked at the trophy on his desk, then at the reflection of the two legacy Vances in the window. They looked like gods in their own minds, glowing in the afternoon sun. I'll see you at the gala, Father. I wouldn't miss the reveal for anything. As she turned to leave, she caught Sienna's eye in the mirror. For a fleeting second, the younger sister's smirk faltered. She saw the lack of fear in Nora's gaze, a confidence that didn't belong to the sister they had spent years breaking. But then Alistair said something about the VIP guest list, and the moment was gone, swallowed by their shared, suffocating arrogance. Nora walked out of the surgical wing and into the humid afternoon air. Julian Sterling was waiting in a black sedan at the curb, his window rolling down as she approached. Is it done? Julian asked, his eyes sharp. Nora reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the flash drive. She felt the weight of the $12 million secret, the digital blade she had handed to her father under the guise of a manual. He hadn't even opened it. He wouldn't. His blindness was her greatest weapon. He thinks he's holding the keys to the kingdom, Nora said, sliding into the passenger seat. She checked her phone. The countdown to the gala stood at 22 hours. He doesn't realize he just signed the eviction notice. The evening of the Vance Medical Foundation Gala arrived with an oppressive, humid heat that threatened a summer storm. Though inside the grand ballroom of the Pier Hotel, the air was chilled to a precise, expensive 68 degrees. Eleanor Nora Vance stood at the edge of the velvetroped entrance. The familiar scent of Casablanca lilies and floor wax triggered a phantom ache in her chest. For years, she had been the ghost at these feasts, the daughter relegated to the shadows while her family preened under the crystal chandeliers. Tonight, she wore the same $40 off-the-rack blazer she'd worn to the lab for a week. It was a deliberate choice, a drab gray shroud that made her nearly invisible against the sea of shimmering silk and midnight blue tuxedos. She felt the weight of the digital credentials in her pocket, not the guest pass her father had begrudgingly issued, but the master override Julian Sterling had secured for her. Nora, what on earth are you doing standing here like a coat check girl? Victoria Vance glided toward her, the train of her emerald Vera Wang gown hissing against the marble floor like a serpent in the grass. She didn't offer a hug or a smile. Instead, her eyes raked over her daughter's blazer with a visceral disgust that made her nostrils flare. The heavy, cloying scent of Victoria's $500 an ounce perfume preceded her, a floral mask for the coldness beneath. I'm just taking it in, Mother, Nora said, her voice level. Well, take it in from the back of the room, Victoria snapped, reaching out to flick a piece of lint off Nora's lapel as if she were handling hazardous waste. She leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper that carried to the nearby socialites. Sienna is doing a live stream for her followers, and the last thing she needs is you ruining the aesthetic of the VIP table. Honestly, Nora, have you no pride? You look like you're here to fix the plumbing. A few feet away, Sienna Vance didn't even look up from her ring light. She was busy pouting for her phone, her diamond-encrusted heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant beat on the floor. "Don't be mean, Mom," Sienna called out without breaking her pose. "Every gala needs a before picture. It makes my after look so much more philanthropic." Nora watched them, her pulse steady. She felt a strange, detached sort of pity. They were so blinded by the glare of their own perceived brilliance that they couldn't see the shadow she was casting. She touched the cold, smooth metal of the flash drive she knew was currently plugged into the podium's laptop. The one Alastair thought contained his career-defining speech. "I'll stay out of the way," Nora promised, a faint smile touching her lips. "I wouldn't want to spoil the surprise." Victoria huffed and turned away, dismissing her with a flick of a manicured hand. "See that you do. Your father is about to make history tonight. Try not to embarrass him by existing too loudly." Nora moved deeper into the ballroom, navigating the forest of tuxedoed backs. She found Marcus Thorne near the technical booth. He looked uncomfortable in a rented suit, his fingers nervously drumming against a tablet. When he saw her, his eyes cleared. He was the only one in this room who knew that the Vance breakthrough about to be announced was actually the result of Nora's 3 years of unpaid, uncredited labor in the basement labs. "Server sync is at 98%, Marcus whispered, leaning close so the nearby waiters wouldn't hear. "Julian is in position. He's at the head table with your father." "Is Alastair nervous?" Nora asked. "Not at all," Marcus said, a grimace twisting his features. "He's currently telling the Surgeon General that he personally synthesized the protein chain. He's practically glowing with his own lies." Nora looked toward the head table. Dr. Alastair Vance sat like a king in a bespoke silk suit that cost more than Nora's annual research budget. He was holding court, a glass of vintage crystal in his hand, laughing at something Julian Sterling had said. Julian, ever the predator, played his part perfectly. He looked the image of the billionaire benefactor, but as his gaze drifted across the room and locked onto Nora's, she saw the sharp, lethal edge in his eyes. He checked his watch, a subtle signal. 10 minutes. The room began to dim, the frantic chatter of 500 wealthy donors softening into an expectant hum. The clink of silver against china died down as the stage lights hummed to life, casting a golden glow over the podium. Alastair stood, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a silver serving platter. He walked toward the stage with the casual, sweeping confidence of a man who believed the world was his birthright. As he passed Nora, who was standing by a service pillar, he didn't even pause. He simply handed her his empty champagne glass without looking at her. "Hold that, would you?" he muttered, his mind already on the standing ovation he expected. "And tell the kitchen the sea bass was a touch dry." Nora took the glass, the crystal cold and sweating against her palm. She watched his broad, arrogant back as he ascended the stairs to the podium. He looked out over the crowd, his smile radiant and utterly false. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alastair began, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the Vance Foundation. We celebrate a new era of medicine, an era I have spent the last decade pioneering." In the back of the room, Nora set the empty glass down on a waiter's tray. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened a single app. The interface was simple, a red button labeled Execute. She looked at her mother, who was watching Alastair with a look of predatory pride. She looked at Sienna, who was recording the moment for her millions of fans, her face a mask of practiced adoration. They were all waiting for the face of the future to be revealed on the giant screens behind the podium. Alastair gestured grandly to the screen. "Let me show you the data that will change the world." Nora's thumb hovered over the screen. She thought of the cold nights in the lab, the way Alastair had called her a janitor of science, and the way Victoria had looked at her blazer with such soul-deep shame. The countdown on her screen hit 0. "Wait for it," she whispered to the empty air. She pressed the button. The screen behind Alastair didn't flicker to the medical charts he expected. Instead, A line of code began to crawl across the 30-foot display, followed by a high-definition image of a legal document, a patent filing dated 3 years ago. At the very top, in bold, undeniable letters, was the name of the sole inventor, Eleanor Nora Vance. The ballroom went deathly silent, the only sound the low, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. Alastair didn't notice at first. He was still smiling at the crowd, waiting for the applause to begin. But then he saw the confusion on the faces in the front row. He saw Julian Sterling lean back and cross his arms, a cold, expectant look on his face. Alastair turned around. The color began to drain from his neck, creeping upward like a slow-acting poison as he stared at the screen. Nora stepped out from behind the pillar, the gray blazer no longer a shroud, but armor. She began to walk slowly toward the front of the room, her eyes fixed on the man at the podium who was about to realize that the daughter he had stepped on was the only thing holding up his world. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer respectful. It was heavy, suffocating like the scent of the 1,000 lilies lining the stage. Eleanor Nora Vance continued her steady march toward the podium, the rhythmic click of her heels on the parquetry floor sounding like the countdown of a precision-weighted clock. Dr. Alastair Vance stood paralyzed behind the microphone. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, the color of wet ash. The arrogance that usually sat so heavily on his brow vanished, replaced by a frantic, twitching pulse in his temple. His jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, his bottom lip trembling as he tried to form a word that wouldn't come. The hand gripping the mahogany podium shook so violently that the microphone picked up the rhythmic thud of wood against wood. He looked smaller, his bespoke silk suit suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for a man who had just been hollowed out in front of the world. Nora reached the edge of the stage. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She simply climbed the stairs with the grace of someone who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. "There must be a mistake," Alastair finally wheezed, his voice cracking into a high, thin reed. He turned his head toward the board members in the front row, his eyes darting like a trapped animal S. "A clerical error, a joke. Nora, tell them. Tell them you were just the assistant." Nora stepped into the light of the projector, the blue glow of her own patent filing illuminating her face. She looked at her father, seeing not the giant who had cast her into the shadows for a decade, but a desperate man clinging to a stolen legacy. "It wasn't a joke when you signed the laboratory logs every Friday, Alastair," she said, her voice amplified by the secondary microphone, cold and clear as a winter morning. "Though I suppose you never actually read what you were signing. You were too busy practicing your speech for tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. In the front row, Victoria Vance sat as if turned to stone, her manicured fingers digging so hard into her silk clutch that the fabric audibly strained. Beside her, Sienna Vance had stopped recording. The influencer's phone was lowered, her face pale as she realized the janitor she had mocked for her followers was currently the most powerful person in the room. Julian Sterling leaned forward, his expression one of sharp, predatory interest. He wasn't looking at the crumbling doctor, he was looking at Nora. He stood up slowly, the movement drawing every eye in the room. "Dr. Vance," Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of a billion-dollar empire. He looked at Alastair, then pointedly shifted his gaze to Nora. "I believe there is a confusion of titles. My firm didn't come here to invest in a name. We came to invest in the mind behind the Vance shunt." He stepped toward the stage, offering a hand to Nora. "And the records I've just received from my legal team, records provided by a Mr. Marcus Thorne, confirm that the mind belongs to the woman standing next to you." Marcus Thorne stood near the exit, a tablet in his hand and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He caught Nora's eye and gave a single, firm nod. The trap was fully sprung. Alastair lunged for the microphone, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. "This is my clinic. My name is on the door. You are a child playing with things you don't understand. I disowned you for a reason." "You disowned me because I wouldn't let you put your name on the prototype 3 years ago," Nora countered, her voice dropping an octave. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. She held it up for the board members to see. This contains the original encrypted source code for the Shunt's AI. It's keyed to my biometric signature. Without it, the devices you've already pre-sold to the European markets are nothing more than expensive paperweights. The silence returned, deeper this time. The board members, men and women who valued profit above all else, began to physically pull away from Alistair. They shifted their chairs, creating a literal gap between themselves and the man they had been applauding moments ago. Nora leaned into the microphone, her eyes locked onto her father's. "You said I didn't belong in your world, Alistair. You were right. I'm busy building my own." She turned to the audience, her gaze sweeping over her stunned mother and her trembling sister. "The Vance Clinic is under new management as of 5 minutes ago. Security is waiting in the lobby to escort the former chief of surgery to his office to collect his personal belongings." Alistair opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He collapsed back into the chair behind him, the sound of his heavy breathing amplified by the mic. Nora didn't stay to watch him break. She handed the flash drive to Julian, whispered a single sentence in his ear that made his eyes widen, and walked off the stage. She reached the ballroom doors just as the first reporter broke the silence with a shouted question. She didn't look back. She had one more stop to make, and the keys in her pocket didn't just open a lab, they opened the vault to the Vance family's oldest, darkest secret. The sterile silence of the Vance research wing was a sharp, cold blade compared to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Eleanor Nora Vance stood before the heavy titanium doors of the restricted archives, her breath hitching as she pressed her thumb to the scanner. For 10 years, this room had been her father's sanctuary and her prison, the place where her brilliance was harvested and rebranded under the Vance name. The scanner beeped, turning a mocking shade of green. The air inside smelled of ozone and old paper, a scent that usually triggered a Pavlovian sense of dread in her chest. Not tonight. Tonight, the scent felt like victory. She walked past the rows of servers to the physical vault at the back, pulling a small, jagged key from her pocket. It was a relic Dr. Alistair Vance had forgotten she possessed, a duplicate she'd made when she was 19 and still believed his praise was a reward rather than a trap. The heavy drawer slid open with a metallic groan. Inside lay the black ledger, the original, handwritten logs of the Vance protocol. "Step away from the files, Nora." The voice was a jagged rasp. She didn't turn around immediately. She felt the vibration of footsteps on the polished linoleum, the frantic, uneven gait of a man who had just watched his kingdom catch fire. When she finally turned, Alistair stood in the doorway, his bespoke silk suit jacket discarded, his white shirt translucent with sweat. Behind him, Victoria Vance hovered like a ghost, her face a mask of frozen horror, while Sienna Vance stood gripped by a rare, trembling silence, her phone finally lowered. "It's over, Alistair," Nora said, her voice sounding unnervingly calm in the hollow space. She held up the ledger. "The board is already reviewing the digital files Julian Sterling sent them. But this is the physical proof that you didn't just steal my work. You altered the data to hide the toxicity reports." Alistair's jaw didn't just drop. It seemed to unhinge, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, pathetic twitch. The deep mahogany tan he'd cultivated on the Mediterranean curdled into a sickly, gray-green hue that made him look 20 years older in the harsh, fluorescent light. His eyes, usually sharp with calculated condescension, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the security guards appearing in the hallway as if looking for a ghost. A single bead of sweat tracked through the heavy foundation Victoria had insisted he wear for the gala, carving a pale, jagged line down his cheek that exposed the terrified, hollow man beneath the prestige. "You're delusional," Victoria hissed, stepping forward, her diamonds catching the sterile light. The cloying scent of her expensive lily perfume filled the space, a smell Nora had associated with maternal rejection for 2 decades. "We gave you everything. We gave you a name. You can't do this to the family. Think of the brand, Nora. Think of your sister's future." "The brand is a lie built on poisoned blood," Nora replied, her gaze shifting to Sienna. Her sister looked small, the influencer bravado stripped away to reveal a girl who realized her entire lifestyle was funded by a fraud. And Sienna's future was never my responsibility. It was yours. You just chose to use me as the currency to pay for it. Marcus Thorne stepped into the room then, flanked by two men in dark suits. He held a tablet, his face grim but his eyes shining with a protective pride that made Nora's throat tighten. "The authorities are downstairs, Dr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice echoing. "The medical board has issued an emergency suspension of your license effective immediately. They've seen the unredacted toxicity logs." Alistair let out a sound, a high, keening whine that was entirely unbefitting of a chief of surgery. He lunged toward the ledger, his fingers clawing the air, but the security guards were faster. They caught his arms, pinning the legacy surgeon against the very cabinets that held his stolen glory. "You can't do this," Alistair screamed, the sound echoing off the cold metal. "I am Dr. Alistair Vance. I built this city's reputation." "No," Nora said, walking toward him until she was inches away. She could see the pores on his face, the terror in his pupils. She felt no rage, only a profound, cooling relief. "I built the reputation. You just signed the checks, and as of tonight, the accounts are closed." Julian Sterling appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding the room into a sudden, respectful silence. He didn't look at the broken man being held by security. He looked only at Nora. "The press is waiting at the gates, Eleanor, and the board has a car waiting to take you to the headquarters. They want to discuss your terms for the merger." Nora tucked the ledger under her arm. The weight of it felt right. A decade of stolen time finally returned to its rightful owner. She walked past her mother, who was now weeping silently into a silk handkerchief, and past Sienna, who looked at her with a mix of fear and newfound awe. At the door, Nora paused and looked back at her father. He was slumped in the guard's grip, his prestige stripped away, leaving nothing but a wrinkled shirt and a name that no longer carried power. "You told me once that I didn't have the stomach for the Vance legacy," Nora said, her voice a soft, lethal whisper. "You were right. I'm starting my own, and the first thing I'm doing is taking the Vance name off the building." She didn't wait for his response. She walked out of the lab, the rhythmic click of her modest heels on the tile sounding like a countdown reaching 0. As she stepped into the night air, the flashes of the waiting cameras didn't feel like an intrusion. They felt like a dawn. She had one more stop to make, a place where the secrets weren't kept in vaults, but buried in the archives of the city's oldest law firm. The reckoning had only just begun. 6 months had passed since the glass and steel heights of the Vance ancestral estate had been shaken by the sound of a legacy crumbling. The seasons had shifted, the biting winter air giving way to a crisp, ambitious spring that seemed to mirror the transformation within the walls of the newly christened Sterling Vance Research Institute. Eleanor Nora Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her top-floor office, the morning sun glinting off the matte black surface of her mahogany desk. She wasn't wearing the $40 off-the-rack blazer today. Instead, she wore a charcoal wool suit, tailored with a precision that didn't just fit her frame. It announced her presence. Yet, in the corner of her private wardrobe, that old, frayed blazer still hung on a cedar hanger. It was a reminder of the woman who had survived on grit and hidden brilliance while the world looked through her. The door chided with a soft, electronic chime before Julian Sterling stepped inside. He looked as impeccable as ever, though the usual predatory edge in his eyes had softened into something resembling genuine respect. He carried 2 cups of espresso, the rich, nutty aroma cutting through the sterile ozone of the building's advanced air filtration system. "The final audit of the liquidation is complete," Julian said, placing a cup on her desk. He leaned back against the edge of the table, his movements fluid and relaxed. "The penthouse in the city, the vineyard in Napa, and the primary residence, all sold. The proceeds have been diverted into the foundation's endowment, just as you requested." Nora took a slow sip of the coffee, the heat grounding her. "And the occupants?" "Dr. Alistair Vance has moved into a 2-bedroom rental in the suburbs," Julian replied, his voice devoid of pity. He attempted to consult for a pharmaceutical startup last month, but the board caught wind of the ethics violations from the Sterling Vance takeover. They rescinded the offer within 48 hours. Without a medical license or a boardroom to command, he spends most of his time writing letters to the medical board that no one reads. Nora looked out at the city skyline. She pictured her father, the man who had once treated his children like line items on a balance sheet, sitting in a quiet apartment where no one jumped at his command. The silence must be deafening for him. "And Victoria?" Nora asked. "Your mother is struggling with the transition to social invisibility," Julian said with a faint, dry smile. "She tried to host a charity luncheon at the country club last week. Only 3 people showed up, and 2 of them were there to ask if she was selling her vintage Birkin collection. She's currently living on a fixed annuity, enough to keep her fed, but not enough to keep her in the front row of Fashion Week." The image of Victoria Vance, the woman who had valued a designer label more than her daughter's happiness, bartering her handbags for a semblance of status, was a visceral form of karma. It wasn't a sudden explosion of ruin, but a slow, agonizing erosion of the only thing she had ever loved, her reputation. A light knock at the door preceded Marcus Thorne. He looked different now, healthier, his shoulders broader, the weary shadow of the underpaid lab tech replaced by the quiet confidence of a lead researcher. He held a digital tablet, his thumbs scrolling through a series of successful trial results. "The first batch of the neurological patent is ready for public distribution, Nora," Marcus said, his voice bright with a triumph they had both earned in the trenches. "We're already seeing a 40% improvement in patient recovery times. The name on the patent is yours, just yours." Nora looked at Marcus, the witness to her darkest hours, and felt a swell of achievement that no amount of inherited wealth could have bought. "It's ours, Marcus. We're changing the name on the building, but we're also changing the lives of the people inside it." Sienna Vance, she knew from the morning's brief social media check, was currently attempting a minimalist lifestyle rebrand on her failing channels. Without the Vance coffers to fund her travel and wardrobe, her follower count had plummeted. The influencers who once flocked to her side had moved on to fresher, wealthier prey. Sienna was learning the hard way that when the money disappears, the friends follow the scent of the next check. As Marcus and Julian discussed the afternoon's press release, Nora felt a sudden, sharp pang of something she hadn't expected, a quiet, hollow grief. She had won. She had taken the crown, the company, and the very name they had tried to strip from her. But the cost was the total annihilation of the family she had once wished would simply love her. She walked over to her desk and picked up a small, silver-framed photograph that had been tucked away in a drawer. It was an old picture of her as a child, standing between Alistair and Victoria. They weren't looking at her. They were looking at the camera, posing for a world that no longer cared they existed. Nora placed the photo face down on the desk. The weight of the past was finally gone, replaced by the heavy, golden responsibility of the future. She turned back to the window as the crane outside lowered the final letter of the old VANCE Biotech sign. The new sign was already rising. It didn't represent a dynasty built on blood and arrogance. It represented a woman who had been cast out, only to return and rebuild the world on her own terms. As the sun hit the new glass, Nora realized that the greatest revenge wasn't seeing them fall. It was realizing she no longer needed to watch them at all.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.